Hello, everybody. We'll get started with our HoUSed call very shortly, just allowing people a few moments to register and to sign in. So we'll be back in just a minute. Good afternoon, everyone. We still have a lot of people signing into the call, so I'm just going to give it a few more seconds and then we'll get started. Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Welcome to today's National HoUSed campaign call for universal, stable, affordable housing. I'm Paul Keeley, the NLIHC Chief Operating Officer, and I want to welcome you today to today's call. I think we have a great call lined up for you. Just to give you a little bit of an overview, a little later in the call, as you can see from the agenda, we will be joined by House Majority Whip James Clyburn to talk about the importance of including historic housing investments in the Build Back Better Act and his perspectives on the prospect for that. We'll begin with Sarah Sadian at NLIHC sharing the latest developments in the negotiations on Build Back Better and the ongoing advocacy needed to ensure that the bill is passed with essential housing investments, as well as provide an update on the FY22 appropriations, which is really the other opportunity we as advocates have to advance our HoUSed agenda. So she'll give us an update on those things. We'll also discuss Treasury's final rule for state and local fiscal recovery funds and how they can be used for affordable housing, which just came out last week. We will get updates on NLIHC's end rental arrears to stop evictions project and the most recent Treasury emergency rental assistance spending data, as well as Treasury's announcements about recapture and reallocation of funding. We'll get some updates from the field and more. So a lot to cover in today's call, a lot of great information. I do want to just remind everybody to please, if you have a question for one of the speakers or one of our panelists, if you could please enter it into the Q&A box. Of course, feel free to use the chat function for sharing information among attendees, but I'll mainly focus on the Q&A box for questions for the speakers. Okay, so very good. We'll go ahead and get started with an update on Build Back Better and the FY22 appropriations with VP for Public Policy at NLIHC, Sarah Sadian. Sarah, take it away.
Great, thanks, Paul, and it's good to be here with everybody. Just a reminder for folks to put their questions in the Q&A box. I want to make sure that we're answering as many questions as possible. So in terms of where the Build Back Better Act is right now, and its historic investments in rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund, we are in a bit of a limbo period with the bill. You may remember, I know we've talked about it on past calls, that in mid-December, Senator Manchin announced, I think surprising many of us, saying that he would not vote for the bill as currently written And that really meant that Democrats would have to go back to the drawing board, both on the housing investments possibly, but certainly the larger bill to make sure that they could get his support. As you guys remember, the Build Back Better Act includes really major investments in affordable housing. Overall, more than $150 billion would be provided for housing investments, including, excuse me, $25 billion for rental assistance to serve another 300,000 households, public housing money, about $65 billion to preserve public housing for the more than 2 million residents who live there, and $15 billion for the National Housing Trust Fund, which we think would build about 150,000 new homes for people with the lowest incomes and the greatest needs. So there's a lot at stake right now with this bill and the path forward. Sorry. So this week through MLK Day, we expect Congress to be turning its attention away from Build Back Better and towards voting rights legislation. The idea is that they are working very hard this week to garner the votes they need in order to pass that legislation, especially with MLK Day approaching. And then they'll turn their attention back to Build Back Better. This is sort of a side note, but I think the advocates who've been working in the voting rights space are seeing some of the same challenges that we've been seeing with Build Back Better, which is that both bills would require Democrats to be 100% on board, every single one of them in the Senate, with the strategy to move forward. And there are still some holdouts, Senator Manchin and Sinema, who aren't yet on board with the path forward for that bill. So it should sound very familiar to us in terms of what we're doing here. In terms of where things go, it's like I mentioned, it's a little unclear whether Senate Democrats are going to be able to restart negotiations over this package, what that package could possibly look like, and whether it would include housing investments. Just this week, we found out there was reports from the media that when Senator Manchin was going back and forth with President Biden, that one of his proposals for a $1.8 trillion package did not include housing dollars. And I think that shows that we really have to be very vocal, very consistent, very effective in our advocacy to make sure that if there is a deal, that that deal includes housing investments. I know that the other thing I think that is a possible risk here is that we might see congressional Democrats and President Biden be so eager and so willing to accept any deal that Senator Manchin proposes that it means that housing investments could be at risk, even if we have really strong support like we do from the administration and from Senate leadership in particular and other congressional leaders, right? The closer we get to midterm elections, the further into the calendar year, the more leverage Senator Manchin has to really dictate the terms of any possible deal. So that being said, I know most of you are not from West Virginia. Our folks in West Virginia are doing all that they can to convince their senator to get on board with this package. But that doesn't mean that there isn't work for you guys to do now. It's incredibly important that advocates are weighing in with their members of Congress to reiterate that they're paying attention to Build Back Better and that housing resources have to be in any final package. I know many of you might say, I've heard from my Democratic members of Congress, I've talked to them many, many times over the last several months. They support housing investments. They are on the same page with us. And even though you might be getting really good feedback from your members, it's important for you to keep up the drumbeat of support for housing investments. One reason for that is because right now, congressional leaders are going to be forced to make difficult decisions about what, if anything, needs to get cut from the package. And if every other advocate from other sectors are being very loud and vocal about the need for climate change investments or childcare provisions or paid family leave, and housing is not, then we become the easiest thing to cut from the package as needed. So it's important that we're continuing to keep that drumbeat up. It's also important because we need those members of Congress, not just to be supportive in their own right, but for them to be actively weighing in with House and Senate leadership and the White House to reiterate their support. So the message or the ask to your member of Congress shouldn't be, just merely for them to support these housing investments, but for them to take a proactive step in calling for these investments with their leadership and with the White House. From what we've heard, these negotiations are going to be at the very highest levels in Congress. Very few people are going to be in the room when decisions are made. But when Senator Schumer or Speaker Pelosi or President Biden know that a large contingency of their caucus is demanding housing resources, they'll know when they're in that room to cut a deal that housing has to be there. So you want to keep that up. I think it's also really important for us to be spelling out to our members of Congress what these housing investments could mean. What does it mean for people in your community if they're able to receive rental assistance? What does it mean for a home to be built with housing trust fund dollars or public housing to be rebuilt? It's really helpful for all of you to be sharing stories of people who are in need of assistance who could directly benefit from these investments. And we've found that there's a lot of data that we can share. There's a lot of resources that we can share at the national level. But really what's most effective and persuasive for members of Congress is hearing from constituents and hearing the stories of those who would be helped in the process. So please keep that going. I will say that we do have something to look back towards as a guide for how we can act in this moment. We were in a very similar situation earlier this summer when it looked like housing investments were going to be cut from the bill. I know that we had talked about at that point in time, there was a proposal to maybe even eliminate altogether housing investments, maybe to cut it down to just $30 billion. But because housing advocates were very loud and consistent and effective in our advocacy, because we were working hand in glove with our congressional champions, we were able to really restore a lot of funding, $150 billion in funding. And so we know what it takes to get this across the finish line. I want to encourage you to use the next couple of weeks to do that. We probably won't see that negotiation, as I mentioned, take place maybe publicly until after Congress is done dealing with the voting rights legislation. But that doesn't mean that conversations aren't happening behind closed doors or that your advocacy isn't important right now. So I want to encourage you not to wait. Really use this moment to drive home the point that these are historic investments. This is a once in a lifetime opportunity to get them done. And we need to act like that and really start to defend these housing investments as the conversation moves forward. I also want to speak a little bit about the appropriations process because it's very easy for us to get caught up in what's happening with this major bill, the Build Back Better Act, but there are other opportunities to also increase housing resources and advance the House campaign as we work towards a universal housing system. So the appropriations bill at hand is currently being negotiated. Congress is currently, or the federal government is currently being operated under what's called a continuing resolution, which merely just carries forward funding from the previous year with no necessarily increases to those programs. That CR ends February 18th, but we're hearing there might be a short-term CR after that to bring the government funded through March. But we know that seems to be really strong interest from both House and Senate, Democrats and Republicans to hopefully negotiate a final spending bill with new spending numbers, not just carrying over the funding from last year. That's really important. That deal making that's going on, hopefully in the next couple months, is really important because we could see a sizable increase in funding for housing investments through the appropriations bill. But again, only if advocates are taking that message to their members of Congress. The House bill that was approved earlier this summer in July would provide a almost $7 billion increase to HUD programs, including a significant expansion of rental assistance through the Housing Choice Voucher program. In fact, the House proposal would increase that program would serve an additional 125,000 households. What's really important to remember is that once a voucher is created through the appropriations process, it's very likely that we'll see that funding continued going forward. So this is not a time-limited process here or time-limited vouchers. We think once we have them created, they will be here to serve households going forward. And if you recall, that's about half the size of the investment in the Build Back Better Act. And so it's important that we achieve both of them. we have an opportunity to do that. The Senate bill, however, does not include that major expansion of housing vouchers. So there's a real difference at stake about whether or not Congress agrees to take the Senate numbers or take the House numbers. And this is where you can play a big role in making sure that Congress knows what's at stake in terms of passing a final spending bill. I think we've mentioned this on earlier calls, but there is some threat that Congress does not reach a final spending agreement this year, which would mean that the continuing resolution would last for the entire year. That has really negative consequences for housing programs. And that's largely because housing programs are, and the cost of rental assistance, for example, is tied to what's happening in rental markets across the country. As rents increase in your neighborhood, it means the cost of rental assistance increases. And if we just have a continuing resolution, it really acts as a cut to housing programs because there wouldn't be enough funding to fully fund rental assistance going forward. We might end up seeing Congress move money around to keep the housing voucher program funded at the same levels as last year, but that means cuts from other housing programs. And with the housing crisis the way it is, we really can't afford to lose resources, especially as we're fighting to try to get more resources and Build Back Better and appropriations. So it's really important that you're carrying that message to your members of Congress. We'd love to encourage you to call them, to ask them to quickly pass a final spending bill, but also to make sure that that spending bill includes the House proposal to expand rental assistance to 125,000 families. So that's two major ways that you can take action. We talked about the Build Back Better Act, the FY22 appropriations bill. Just a quick reminder to keep your focus on both. One, ask them to ensure that the historic investments in rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund make it into any final negotiated Build Back Better Act legislation. And two, encourage your members to quickly enact a final spending bill that includes a major expansion of rental assistance that's included in the House bill. I do want to say just one word about maybe a possible supplemental bill on emergency funds related to COVID. We're hearing that that might be a possibility, although it sounds like it will be very narrow in scope. I do not expect there to be housing resources in that bill. I think it's mostly going to be focused on the needs of small businesses and perhaps some healthcare money to help increase testing and things of the like. And so with that, I will turn it back to Paul to see if there are any questions from attendees.
Very good. Thank you, Sarah. Yeah, there are some questions here that I do want to try to get to. So Peter Lawrence says that the Washington Post reported over the weekend that Senator Manchin's Build Back Better counteroffer to the White House did not include any housing proposals. Do you have any insight on why Manchin did not include housing proposals in his counteroffer? And I'll also just tack onto this is I think some reporting yesterday was that Manchin came back, with a $1.8 billion, $1.8 trillion proposal, and that he's actually now indicating he's not even willing to go forward with that. Do you have any thoughts about either of those two questions?
Yeah, it's a great question from Peter. It is, I'm not sure what the particular reason is for Manchin not including housing. I do know that for some time, Senator Manchin has said that his approach to Build Back Better would be to focus on just a small number of items, but to fully fund them for the full 10-year window that's allowed if you use the budget reconciliation process. So I think my guess, reading his proposal or seeing the reporting out about that, is that it has more to do with how to fit a small number of priorities into, one top line number that you can't budge, at $1.8 trillion. In terms of Manchin rescinding that offer that he made, it points to just how challenging and uncertain the future of this bill is. I know I've spoken to a lot of staffers who are either who are still waiting to hear from their leadership about where things go from here. Many of them are cut out of the negotiating process. Like I said before, those decisions are going to be made at the very highest levels. But I think that Senator Manchin's rhetoric here is very concerning, and I think it underscores why we have to be very loud about how we need a Build Back Better Act, and that it has to have housing in it because it's not guaranteed.
Great, thanks, Sarah. Sarah, Jerry Pohe asked the question, how has voting rights superseded Build Back Better for the remainder of January beyond MLK Day? And how do we triangulate within this democratic political reality? Any thoughts on that question? I mean, there's he adds on here, what does Senator Manchin's newfound softness on housing without housing on 1.8 trillion portend? And then there are a few other questions that are kind of related I'll get to after you address that one.
Yeah, so it is frustrating from my part that Congress is shifting their attention away from Build Back Better. But from what I've heard, there's a couple of reasons for it. One is that in addition to the voting rights bill being a very important piece of legislation to try to pass, is that they're working up against a deadline in state legislatures. So Congress wants to be able to pass this voting rights legislation in time for states to implement it so that they're prepared for the midterm elections this coming fall. I have only heard, however, that Congress is really going to focus on voting rights until about MLK Day. I don't know if it's going to extend beyond that. But part of the, I think, strategy here is that it provides maybe a little cooling down period. When Manchin gave his announcement that he wasn't going to vote for the legislation, things were really heated and tense from what I've read in the media. Maybe this provides a little cooling down time for people to come back to the table and let cooler heads prevail. It certainly provides, I think, President Biden and congressional leaders a little bit more time to think about strategically about how they move forward with Build Back Better and what it might take to get them there.
Great. And there are several questions that are sort of along the same lines about, fact sheet that we might have on the appropriations bill and the negative implications if we don't have a full appropriations bill. Do you have a guide published for key points on both advocacy measures? And then, somebody else said, can you send an email with a summary of the points our representatives need to emphasize? I'm not terribly clear what to say to them. So there were several sort of in that same framework of, do you have a relatively quick, brief, guide to what to be saying on both Build Back Better and the appropriations?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm sure my colleagues have shared links in the chat box, but what we can do is make sure that when we're sending a follow-up email like we do after every national call, we can share a link to our advocacy toolkit around Build Back Better, our fact sheet on the resources that are currently in the bill, and a reminder about what our top messaging is for that. Same thing we can do around appropriations. We have a comparison chart of the different funding levels of the Senate side versus the House side, and we can reiterate what you need to say to your members of Congress when you're reaching out to them. I don't have that on me right now, but we'll make sure that we follow up so people feel very comfortable reaching out on all of these issues.
All right, fantastic, Sarah. Thank you so much. There are a few other questions that you might want to take a look at in the Q&A section there. But I think you've really provided a lot of great background information. So thanks a million.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Okay, so we will move on to the next item in our agenda, and that is to discuss the latest from Department of Treasury to put out a final rule on state and local fiscal recovery funds and how they may be used for affordable housing. We've been having lots of questions from participants on this call and others about this very question. So I'm really pleased to have with us Elena Calabro, policy analyst at NLIHC, to discuss what just came out last week. Elena, it's all yours.
Hi, everyone. So yes, my name is Elena Calabro. I'm a policy analyst with the Coalition. And today I'll just be providing a brief overview of Treasury's final rule for the coronavirus state and local fiscal recovery funds, SLFRF, which I sometimes find tricky to say, but we'll go with that. So next slide, please. So as part of the American Rescue Plan, Congress provided $350 billion for the SLFRF program to help state and local governments respond to the COVID-19 public health emergency, address its economic fallout, and lay the foundation for an equitable recovery. The program ensures governments have the resources needed to respond to and recover from the pandemic, including providing emergency housing assistance and programs and services to support long-term housing security. The Treasury Department, which is administering the program, published an interim final rule in May of last year, which described eligible and ineligible uses of funds and other program provisions. Treasury says they received over 1,500 public comments, including from NLIHC. We did weigh in with Treasury on its interim final rule with a comment we submitted last June, and we also followed up with them in September. We're really urging Treasury to issue clearer guidance on how state and local governments can use these funds, which is a major infusion of funding, to meet the housing needs in their communities. And we've already seen state and local governments using these funds for housing. We've actually been tracking that. We've been highlighting certain examples of that, and I can share a link to that resource later on. Next slide, please. So the final rule that Treasury released last week provides broader flexibility and greater simplicity in the program, and it responds to many of NLIHC's recommendations. The final rule takes effect on April 1st, but Treasury says that recipients can choose to take advantage of its flexibilities and simplifications now. So there are just several improvements that I wanted to highlight today. First, the final rule presumes that an expanded set of households and communities are impacted and disproportionately impacted by the pandemic, which is supposed to make it easier for state and local governments to help low and moderate income populations without needing to identify and document a specific negative economic impact. And I'll discuss the definitions of impacted and disproportionately impacted in a moment. The final rule also recognizes categorical eligibility for programs and populations, which is great too. Importantly, the final rule expands the list of eligible housing programs for impacted communities. So the rule makes affordable housing development, permanent supportive housing, or other programs to improve access to stable, affordable housing among people who are homeless available to impacted households and communities, not just those considered disproportionately impacted. And finally, the rule provides further clarity on eligible affordable housing projects, which is something that NLIHC and other advocates were calling on Treasury to do. Next slide. So what's the deal with this distinction between impacted and disproportionately impacted? Treasury says that to simplify the administration of the program, the final rule presumes that certain populations were impacted or disproportionately impacted, and they're presumed to be eligible for services that respond to that impact that they experienced. So the final rule recognizes that the pandemic caused broad impacts that affected many communities and households. And at the same time, the pandemic caused disproportionate or more severe health and economic outcomes for certain households and communities. And Treasury notes that this is often due to pre-existing disparities. So Treasury presumes that low and moderate income households are impacted and low income households were disproportionately impacted. The final rule offers the option to define low and moderate income on federal poverty guidelines or based on area median income. Treasury posted a spreadsheet online to help recipients determine income thresholds in their jurisdiction. And then the next two slides, I'll just break down the eligibility and eligible uses for each category. Next slide. So households and communities presumed to be impacted by the pandemic include low or moderate income households and communities. And Treasury defines this as households with incomes at or below 300% of the federal poverty guidelines for the size of the household, or those with incomes at or below 65% of the area median income. Impacted households also include those that experience unemployment or increased food or housing insecurity. Households also that qualify for certain federal programs. And when providing affordable housing programs, specifically, households that qualify for the National Housing Trust Fund and Home Investment Partnership Program are presumed to be impacted, and thus eligible for the following services. So in terms of eligible services, impacted households are eligible for emergency housing assistance, which can include rent, mortgage, and utility assistance, housing stability services, such as housing counseling and legal aid to prevent evictions, individual level assistance for people experiencing homelessness, such as rapid rehousing services, or assistance for groups of individuals. This could include the lease of hotels, motels, and other properties to expand shelter. State and local governments can also use these funds to provide programs or services to promote long-term housing security for impacted communities. And this can include affordable housing development and permanent supportive housing. Next slide. And as for disproportionately impacted households and communities, the final rule presumes that low-income households, and Treasury defines this as those with incomes at or below 185% of the federal poverty guidelines or 40% of AMI, households that reside in qualified census tracts, those that receive certain federal benefits, including Section 8 vouchers, or those that receive services by tribal governments or reside in US territories, are all considered to be disproportionately impacted. And in addition to the programs and services available for impacted communities that we discussed in the previous slide, governments can use SLFRF funds to provide housing vouchers and relocation assistance for disproportionately impacted households and communities. Recipients can also make improvements to vacant and abandoned properties, which can include converting properties to affordable housing within these communities. And beyond these uses, Treasury provides a framework for recipients to identify other impacted communities and activities that aren't listed in the final rule. Treasury stresses that this is a non-exhaustive list. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned earlier, several uses that were included in the interim final rule for disproportionately impacted communities are now eligible for impacted communities, available for a broader set of the population. And these include permanent supportive housing and the development of affordable housing. Housing vouchers and relocation assistance they remain in the category available to disproportionately impacted communities. Next slide. And in addition to programs and services, Treasury's final rule clarifies that recipients can use SLFRF funds for capital expenditures that support an eligible COVID-19 public health or economic response, including building certain affordable housing. And I see that someone asked in the Q&A, what does certain affordable housing mean? Which is a great question. According to the final rule, Treasury presumes that any projects that would be eligible for the National Housing Trust Fund or under the Home Program are eligible uses of SLFRF funds. Important to note, however, that these programs do use different income limits than the definitions adopted by Treasury. And the final rule also states that affordable housing projects eligible for funding under the Indian Housing Block Grant Program, the Indian Community Development Block Grant Program, or the Bureau of Indian Affairs Housing Improvement Program are also eligible. And in the final rule, Treasury says that aligning with these programs is intended to provide recipients with clarity and comfort as they design and implement a variety of affordable housing projects, including the production, rehabilitation, and preservation of affordable rental housing. So one thing that we brought up in our comment letter to Treasury is that the interim final rule presumed that housing investments, including the development of affordable housing, were eligible when provided in qualified census tracts, as well as by tribal governments and then to other disproportionately impacted populations. And we urge Treasury to allow housing investments in any community, not just in qualified census tracts, as long as the housing was affordable to those with the lowest incomes. In Treasury's final rule, they respond to this comment and they say that they recognize that qualified census tracts do not reflect all underserved populations. And as discussed, the final rule allows grantees to presume that low-income households have been disproportionately impacted, which is just it provides greater flexibility to serve households and communities in need of housing assistance, not just those in specific geographies. And the final rule also notes that the rehabilitation and repair of public housing is eligible, as are operating expenses for eligible affordable housing units. And then also the final rule notes that grants to support affordable housing development, including those supported by LIHTC, are eligible uses of these funds. And for more information on that, recipients can refer to the treatment of loans section in the final rule. And then just the next slide just has links to several resources from Treasury and from NLIHC. We updated our fact sheet that kind of provides the same information on these slides. And of course, we'll be posting these slides online and sending them in our follow-up email. But I'll go ahead and stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions. It's a lot of information, so.
It was a lot of information and really, really valuable information. Elena, you were getting lots of people saying, fantastic, this is great. Can I get these slides sent to us? And I did share with everybody in the chat. I'll just say it again live that we will send these slides out after the call. So don't worry about that. Lori McCleary said she'd love to follow up with you, and her email is in the chat. So you might want to just take a look at that. And Kathy Nelson makes the good point that, you know, Treasury definitions of low income are much higher than HUD's extremely low income, and it's those with the lowest incomes who most need the help. We agree with you, Kathy. That's always our position. But you know, the guidance is much improved with all of our input. But yes, the income limits are higher than extremely low income. I think, you know, I was going through and you had lots of questions coming in and then you answered them. So during your presentation, I think you caught all of the questions that came in. If anybody still has one and wants to submit one, feel free. Elena will be on the call and she'll be able to see those and be able to type a response into you. Thank you very much for that presentation, Elena. And I think we will now move on in our agenda. So next on our agenda is Emma Foley, research analyst at the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, who's going to talk about the latest information from Treasury on emergency rental assistance spending and some information about reallocations of resources as well. So Emma, I will turn it over to you.
Great, thanks, Paul. So last Friday was a big day for the Emergency Rental Assistance Program as Treasury released new data on ERA spending and ERA reallocation. Next slide. This included data on ERA 1 and ERA 2 November spending progress, ERA 1 third quarter data, as well as data from the first round of reallocation. Today, I will discuss just some initial trends that we're seeing and findings from each of these. And I've gone ahead and linked the relevant data sources here, as well as put them in the chat. Next slide. So just starting with some key takeaways from the November spending data. Overall, $15.9 billion in ERA 1 and ERA 2 has been dispersed to households, with the program reaching over 3.2 million households. ERA 1 refers to the first $25 billion allocation of emergency rental assistance from the Consolidated Appropriations Act of 2021. And ERA 2 refers to the second $21.6 billion allocation from the American Rescue Plan Act. By the end of November, $13.6 billion of the $25 billion ERA 1 allocation was paid to households, representing 54% of the total allocation. $1.5 billion of ERA 1 was distributed in the month of November alone. Of ERA 2, $2.3 billion of the $21.6 billion was paid to households by the end of November, representing 11% of that total allocation. And in November alone, $1.35 billion in ERA 2 was distributed, more than double the amount distributed in October. Next slide. October marked the first month where ERA 1 spending decreased, and this trend continued into November, indicated by the shrinking size of the orange bars in the graph here. Despite this decrease, though, ERA2 spending doubled between October and November, indicated by the growing size of the teal bars on this graph. This is partially expected because the more ERA1 funding that is spent, the less that there is left to spend, yet many grantees have still dispersed very low amounts of their ERA1 allocations. This trend highlights the continual uneven performance of ERA programs. While around 150 programs have spent most of their ERA1 allocation and are transitioning to ERA2, other grantees continue their slow spending, with approximately 60 grantees still having spent less than 1/3 of their ERA1 allocation. This includes several state grantees with high numbers of low-income renter households, such as Georgia, Ohio, and Arizona. Next slide. And this point on uneven performance is just kind of reiterated here, which shows the 10 states spending their ERA1 allocations the most quickly, and the 10 states spending their ERA1 allocations the slowest. California, New York, Minnesota, New Jersey, and Virginia have likely all exhausted their ERA1 allocations by the end of November, since 10% of ERA allocations can be used for administrative expenses. On the other hand, many states continue to lag behind, spending only a very small portion of their ERA1 allocation 11 months after the start of the program. Next slide. And next, I just want to touch on some of the updated data from the third quarter that Treasury also shared in their latest data release. And this data represents the months between July and through September. Quarterly data is more detailed than monthly data, and so it gives us a little more insight into how the ERA program as a whole is operating outside of just spending. The quarterly data points to a continued lag in application processing. While nearly 3.6 million applications were completed from the program start to the end of the third quarter, only 1.5 million households were served during that time frame, or 43% of all applicants. In quarter three, 1.9 million households received ERA1 funding, and 66% of these were extremely low-income households. 21% of households served had incomes between 31% and 50% of their area median income, and 13% had incomes between 51% and 80% of their area median income. This data illustrates that renters with the lowest incomes continue to be the most in need of ERA funding. Next slide. And in addition to spending data and quarterly data, Treasury also released information on the first round of ERA1 reallocation. Per Treasury's reallocation guidance, grantees needed to reach an expenditure ratio of 30% by the end of September 2021 to avoid recapture. Grantees also had the chance to significantly decrease the amount of funds recaptured if they submitted a program improvement plan. Grantees also had the opportunity to voluntarily reallocate some of their funds to grantees within their state during this period. During the first round of reallocation, $875.5 million was voluntarily reallocated, with most funds flowing from state grantees to local grantees and tribal grantees. The states of Wisconsin, Indiana, Louisiana, and Tennessee all reallocated more than 100 million of their ERA1 allocations to grantees within their state. An additional 239.9 million was recaptured from grantees who did not meet the required spending thresholds, though Treasury data does not indicate where these funds were recaptured from. Reallocation will continue to occur every 2 months, and the benchmark that grantees must spend to avoid recapture will continue to increase with each of these reallocation rounds. Next slide. 125 programs received reallocated funds, including 5 states, 91 localities, and 29 tribal entities. The 5 states receiving reallocated funds were California, New Jersey, New York, DC, and Oregon, with California receiving the most funds at 62 million. Far more localities received reallocated funds, with only the highest 5 listed in this table here. Indianapolis, for example, received 91 million, Milwaukee received 61 million, and Omaha received 50 million. And these amounts are all posted in the links that I initially posted in the chat. In many slow spending states, funds were voluntarily reallocated to high need localities, which is a promising trend for getting funds out the door and getting to places where ERA is needed most. However, most reallocation also occurred within the same states, meaning that some states received far less than their anticipated need. New York State, for example, requested $1 billion in reallocated funds and received $27 million. As you can see in the tables here, this also resulted in some localities getting very large reallocations compared to states. This trend may shift in future rounds of reallocation, however, because with each round, the proportion of funds that will be recaptured from slow spending grantees will continue to increase. Next slide. And lastly, NLIHC next slide, I think I have repeating slides. NLIHC continues to track ERA spending in real time on our dashboard, which I will link in the chat. And if you have any questions related to spending or reallocation, feel free to send us an email to research@nlihc.org. And I will stop there and see if there are any questions.
Fantastic, Emma. Thank you very much for that really comprehensive overview. There are a number of intriguing questions in the Q&A box. Just in the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and move on in our agenda, but there are some interesting questions there. If you have time, please go ahead and type your answers into those individuals. I don't think, unfortunately, we're going to have time to get to them right now. So thank you very, very much for that overview. And I think that we have shared links as well. I guess we haven't shared any links, but if you have any, please do share those with the listeners. Thank you very much. Okay, we'll move on now to our first field update. And I'll turn it over to Allison Mcintosh, Policy and Communications Director at Neighborhood Partnerships. Allison, are you there?
I am here. Hi, Paul. How are you?
Great. Take it away.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. My name is Allison Mcintosh, and I work for Neighborhood Partnerships, and my role is to convene the Oregon Housing Alliance, which is a state partner of the National Low-Income Housing Coalition. It's an organization of about 90 organizations that believe everyone deserves a safe, stable, and affordable place to call home. And I wanted to give an update on what's been happening in Oregon. So our eviction moratorium for non-payment of rent ended, unfortunately, on June 30th of 2021. And we were left with a situation of trying to figure out as advocates about what to do to try to protect folks who were still experiencing hardship because of the COVID-19 pandemic and were waiting for rent assistance. During the 2021 legislative session, we put in place a number of protections, unfortunately, none of which were as protective as an eviction moratorium. We gave folks some additional time to access rent assistance or to pay their back rent from during the emergency period. We allowed folks to double up. And then lastly, there were some other detailed protections in there, which I can answer questions about. But before the legislative session ended, they passed a bill that allowed tenants to kind of pause an eviction process for 60 days while they applied for rent assistance. So once someone applied and notified their landlord that they had applied for rent assistance, no eviction could move forward in that 60-day time period. Unfortunately, because of overwhelming demand for rent assistance in our state, it meant it was really hard for organizations to process payments and checks within that 60-day window. And throughout the fall, in September, October, and November, there were more than 10,000 households who were waiting for rent assistance who had passed that 60-day window, which meant they were at really immediate risk of eviction. Oregon also committed, as we saw from the last presentation, all of our ERA 1 and 2 funds. And so while the resources were still and are still being distributed, they had been committed. And so the state stopped accepting new applications for rent assistance on December 1st, unfortunately. I really want to just pause here for 1 second and deeply appreciate the work of the National Low Income Housing Coalition, both to fight for this money in the first place and also to fight to make the application and all the requirements simpler. I think we saw a lot of just difficulty to get resources out the door and comply with all the federal rules of particularly ERA 1. And we know that ERA 2 is a little bit simpler, thanks in large part because of the work of the coalition. So in the late summer and early fall, advocates began working together in Oregon to really fight to get the legislature to come into special session and provide additional protections for renters. Like I said, we knew that there were about 10,000 households that were at really immediate risk of eviction because they had passed their kind of safe harbor period. They didn't have any protections once that clock had ended. Unfortunately, what we found was that legislators were, like probably many of us, really tired of talking about COVID and the economic impacts of COVID. And we also had to fight a narrative about people not going back to work because there was unemployment assistance available or rent assistance available. In Oregon, we have a really low unemployment rate, but we're also seeing folks really struggle to pay their current month's rent, to access rent assistance, and also because Oregon has such high housing costs, just to keep up, particularly if folks are working fewer hours every week. So ultimately, advocates did, it took a long time, but we did eventually get the governor to call the legislature into a special session. It was called for December 13th. And the legislature passed a bill that removed the 60-day time period. So in Oregon, if you've applied for rent assistance, you cannot be evicted while you wait. You and your landlord will just hang tight until there's a determination made about the rent assistance application that you put in. Originally, we had hoped that there would be no sunset date, that we could shift to a policy where no one is evicted while they wait for assistance. But unfortunately, we were not successful in that particular fight. And so these provisions that were passed by the Oregon legislature in December, that provision sunsets. So someone has to have applied for rent assistance and notified their landlord by June 30th of 2022, and they need to have received assistance by September 30th of 2022. It did apply to all pending notices and future notices and filings. So anybody who had a pending eviction case at the time the bill was passed and signed, we were able to make sure that those were put on pause. There were a few other provisions in the bill. Oregon has had now for more than a year an extended eviction notice for non-payment notices. It used to be before the pandemic that you had 72 hours from the time the rent was late before a landlord could file an eviction notice in court. We were able to get that extended to 10 days until September 30th. And along with the bill, we were also successful in securing $215 million in additional resources. $100 million of that went straight into the rent assistance system and will be available to tenants sometime in hopefully mid-January. Another $100 million is going to local community-based organizations and communities to do eviction prevention work, as well as help build out some systems and structures to do some additional eviction prevention work. And then there was also $10 million put into a guarantee fund. So if someone applies for rent assistance and ultimately is deemed ineligible for assistance, which we know is a pretty rare instance, their landlord can seek assistance through that fund. It was a way to try to reduce opposition to the proposal. I guess I would just say in closing, we know we have more work to do. I'm sure you all have more work to do in your states. I'm deeply worried about the ongoing impacts of COVID, the financial impacts, the economic uncertainty, and really combined with the high housing costs in Oregon and the lack of rent assistance in our state generally. I think, as we all know, we're dealing with another wave of cases. And I think what we're seeing in Oregon is that decision makers have, and everyone has a lot of fatigue about managing the impacts of COVID, and COVID is still with us. So thank you so much for having me here today to just highlight what we've been up to in Oregon. Thanks, Paul.
Thank you, Allison. Great summary. I may go ahead and explore some questions that have come in the box here. before Majority Whip Clyburn joins us, and then have our next field presenter go after that, assuming he joins us on time. There's one question here from Jerry Pohe. Allison, does Oregon Neighborhood Partnerships have a synoptic report on your housing support experience with recommendations towards a better future? A collection of compelling narratives from 10,000 families and adults and children unsupported. How have faith communities expressed solidarity with you and the community in need?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have some synopses of the proposal that I'm happy to share. I will say the testimony that was provided during the special session was incredible. People from all across the state were able to share their experiences of waiting for rent assistance directly with legislators, and it was so impactful. It was so meaningful to hear people speak, even though their experiences were incredibly difficult to listen to. It was so important to have them there and have their voices be present for legislators, to have them understand what people are really going through in communities. All of that was recorded and is available as part of the public record. So I'm happy to send those materials along to National Low Income Housing Coalition, so you can share the link. Folks can read testimony directly from tenants or hear from them directly through the video recording, if that would be useful.
Great, that would be so useful, and it's a great suggestion from Jerry. Thank you for submitting that, Jerry. Rachel Effenbein, I think is the name, said, I understand, Allison, that Oregon's Emergency Rental Assistance Program should open back up this week. Do you know what the link to the program's portal will be?
I believe, yeah, that's our understanding, Rachel, is that it will reopen this week. It should be the same, OregonRentalAssistance.org. I'm happy to send that website as well along, Paul.
Great, thank you. There's a question from Mike Weisberg. Was there any provisions to help landlords? We're finding many landlords are unable to make their mortgage payments. Many Section 8 landlords are selling units and leaving the program. Definitely the emergency rental assistance that Allison was talking about is to help landlords with back rent owed for this very purpose. And so that's really a part of what the emergency rental assistance is for, in addition to, of course, keeping people stably housed. Let's see. There's a question here about tracking home ownership assistance funds. That is not something that the National Low Income Housing Coalition is directly involved in. I don't know if that's something, Allison, that your group does.
Yeah, our organization is tracking the rollout of the Homeowner Assistance Fund here in Oregon. And I know that there are lots of other probably state affiliates that are doing that as well. Folks who just happen to own their home and experience low incomes are also facing a foreclosure crisis. And we're certainly seeing similar struggles, I think, in getting resources out the door and approval of the programs and late guidance. And as a lot of resources and rules and regulations to try to navigate. And meanwhile, we have kind of lost sight of the folks who are most directly impacted, right? Which are folks with low incomes in communities who are directly impacted by COVID.
So Allison, I have a question for you. Do you have any suggestions, recommendations for any of the success you had in getting Oregon to allocate some of the state and local fiscal recovery funds for housing? Sounds like you've had some success in that area.
Yeah, we did. In 2021, we were able to get both some resources for additional assistance as well as some money to build and maintain existing affordable housing. I think one of the unique things in Oregon, maybe not so unique, but we are experiencing housing challenges in every corner of our state, in urban and rural areas alike, high housing costs, low vacancy rates. And so our coalition and our partners in every corner of the state talk to legislators all the time about how important safe and stable housing is for folks in communities and just what it means to them. We also were a longtime partner of the Opportunity Starts at Home. So we have lots of multi-sector partners. We work with our union partners, we work with our cities and counties, we work with faith-based organizations, schools, teachers, nurses, anybody we can think of to help tell the story. We work really closely with our food bank here, and anything we can do to try to get legislators to help understand this issue from a different angle. We recently started also working with residents of affordable housing who share their experiences directly with legislators, and it's really helped build a more powerful coalition that kind of speaks with one voice and talks about the important need of these resources.
Outstanding. Well, fantastic report there, Allison. I'm going to check now. I believe that right now is the time for Congressman Clyburn to join us. So let me just check to see if he has joined the call yet. I'm looking to Sarah to see if that's the case.
I'm in touch with our staff. I hope to get an update soon.
Okay, great. So we'll go ahead and move on with our agenda, and then Sarah will let me know. Our next presenter is Paula Martinez from the United Way of Metropolitan Dallas. Paula, are you there?
I'm here.
And I will apologize. I actually told Paula this in our green room before we began, that I may interrupt you if the congressman joins us in the middle of your presentation. I apologize.
Absolutely. It is no problem.
Thanks a million. Go ahead.
Absolutely. So I was asked to speak briefly on the work that we are doing in Dallas to reach out to our community, especially those most vulnerable to evictions and most in need of rental assistance, and just maybe don't have access to the internet or are not able to apply online, which is a system that we have set up in the city of Dallas. And our efforts really turned into a really great pop-up event kind of system that we've created. And it all began with a task force that we set up in the city of Dallas between public, nonprofit, and for-profit sector participants, all who are very much invested in the in eviction prevention and doing work in that area. A lot of our partners in there were a lot of churches and community-based organizations who had a lot of volunteers who were saying, you know, I'm vaccinated now, I'm ready to step out into the community and do what I can to help. And we were seeing that there was a great need in areas that we were seeing a lot of eviction filings being reported. And so we created a quick playbook, kind of tested it, ran with it, and have tweaked it along the way. And, you know, it all starts with selecting that neighborhood. I do have a whole playbook that we've created with our partner, the Child Poverty Action Lab here in Dallas. Hopefully that can be included in the chat box if it has not already been. But we created kind of a 10-step or maybe 12-step playbook as far as how we get ourselves into the community. And it all starts with, again, selecting the neighborhoods with the most need. Like I said, our Child Poverty Action Lab partners have actually worked with our county to receive eviction data on a weekly basis. And so we can see in lifetime here in the county of Dallas where eviction filings are happening the most. And our step one is finding those areas and seeing who we can partner with in that area who have, you know, perhaps they have a building in the area, a church, perhaps a couple libraries, City of Dallas libraries that we could maybe access, and, you know, figuring out where we can set up shop. And next is recruiting those partners. So the United Way is one of several, over a dozen subrecipients of the ERA dollars here in the City of Dallas. And so we know we can tap into several other agencies in our community who have the funds distribute in our area. And so finding those partners who may have rental assistance dollars and kind of teaming together, figuring out what each organization can handle, how much, that kind of helps us determine the size of the event. Next, we think of, depending on where we decide to go to, if we're in a library, we may already have access to technology like computers where we can sit with tenants who we can walk through the application with. If we've done a few that are in parking lots. We even do drive-through style to avoid as much face-to-face interaction or close proximity interactions. And so we have to think about, do we set up laptops in a separate area, have some volunteers collect information on paper, and then we run it to the back and folks are filling it in online. And so we work together to figure out what the best setup is in that sense. Then we go more into obviously determining the basics. How long of an event do we want, depending on folks' ability and how many applicants they can take, depending on funding available. Maybe we can make it a 60-person event. We've done up to 150 people assisted in one day. Using that drive-through method, and so we can get folks in and out pretty quickly. They'll have an assigned number to their car. They'll go to a lane. They'll give us their ticket number per se, and then we receive all of their documents that would be needed for their application. Run to the back, scan it all, and come right back to our to those tenants. Give them their papers back, and it's a pretty quick process. And obviously we work all together to market this to our communities, because so many of our partners are really great institutions already in our community, have really great relationships with folks who may already be asking for the assistance. They have a great network to share out flyers or go to perhaps churches and talk about the assistance available. We've done whatever we can to get the message out in those terms, and it's worked out really great. A lot of our events are kind of open-ended. There's no scheduled times, or we'll do some volunteers who take scheduled or pre-scheduled appointments, and then we have kind of an open door policy as well to catch anyone who maybe sees a sign the morning of and they can get there that afternoon. And it's worked out really well for us. Like I said, there's been so many folks raising their hands wanting to volunteer. And so we have had really great success in getting volunteers at our events. We train them beforehand on what kind of paperwork to expect and what kind of questions may be asked by tenants. One of the greatest learnings we've seen is, even though we're there solely to provide rental assistance, application help, getting them through the application process. Many of them ask, do you also have food that we may have access to? Or maybe they don't need help with rent, but they need help with mortgage assistance, or there's several different other assistance and other needs that are need to be addressed, and they see this opportunity as a place to ask. And so we've created more of like a resource table kind of or resource fair kind of concept as well, of you come in, you do what you need to do with your rental assistance, and then wherever we're queuing up our tenants to in a waiting area or holding area, whatever it may be, there's folks walking around saying, we also have food pantries Monday through Friday, these times, here's a flyer, or here sharing information about their mortgage assistance in case they have friends or family who may also need assistance with that, not necessarily rental assistance. And so like I said, I have a playbook that has been shared in the chat that I think kind of clears up every step-by-step thought that may come up when creating these types of events. We've seen really great success, like I said, up to 150 people per event that may not have otherwise had the opportunity to apply due to just lack of resources or lack of access to the internet. And we've done what we can to get the word out to our community. And so that was really quick. I was trying to be as quick as possible in case the House Majority Whip signed on.
Thank you so much, Paula. What a great presentation. And we have shared a link to the rental assistance pop-up playbook. Plenty of comments here just saying, what a great job. Really fantastic connection with, real-time eviction filings, using that information to help determine where you're going to be, getting local organizations with roots in the community involved, just really great. There are a few questions in the Q&A, but I have heard that House Majority Whip Clyburn has joined us now. So we're going to move on in our agenda. But thank you so much, Paula, for that presentation and the really phenomenal work that you're doing. Really appreciate that. I'm going to invite back our VP for Public Policy, Sarah Sadian, to introduce Congressman Clyburn and to moderate this portion of our agenda. Sarah, are you there?
Hello.
Hello, Majority Whip Clyburn. I'm going to just ask Sarah Sadian, our VP for Public Policy, to do a brief introduction. You're on mute there, Sarah.
I
Sarah, you're
cannot.
on mute.
I'm on mute.
There-
Sorry about
there
that.
you
Okay.
I was saying that we're so glad to have Congressman Jim Clyburn join us today. He represents South Carolina's 6th district and is currently the Majority Whip and the 3rd highest ranking Democrat in the House of Representatives. He previously served as the chairman of the Congressional Black Caucus and the vice chair and later chair of the House Democratic Caucus. He has a long history of working on critical issues related to civil rights and housing issues as well. He started his career organizing civil rights marches and demonstrations as a student leader, and he was a public school teacher. Before being elected to Congress, he directed 2 community development programs. He served on the staff of a South Carolina governor. He ran a state agency under several South Carolina governors. And during his time in Congress, he has been an outspoken advocate for rural communities in particular, and a steadfast supporter of historic preservation and restoration programs. He is a tremendous leader in Congress. We are so pleased that we can have him today to speak about the Build Back Better Act and the housing investments that are in that bill. And I want to just turn it over to you, Congressman, so that you can give your remarks. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and thanks to all of you for participating here today. And let me thank your president, Diane Yentel, for her exemplary leadership and advocacy. I also want to thank Diane once again for her testimony at last summer's Select Subcommittee on the Coronavirus hearing on rental assistance. Your expertise and advocacy have helped accelerate the distribution of rental assistance funds to prevent evictions. We meet today after recently embarking upon another year of the most difficult economic challenge in our lifetime. As housing advocates, you are on the front lines of the biggest issues facing American households. Housing is the single biggest expense for most families and is inextricably linked to the entire economy. My colleagues and I have worked diligently to provide Americans much needed housing relief during this pandemic, but there is much more to be done. Democrats passed President Biden's American Rescue Plan, an essential step in moving America forward, in March of 2021. Congress followed up by passing the Bipartisan Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which President Biden signed into law last November. While I applaud House passage of the Build Back Better Act, we must get this legislation to the president's desk. It is the third leg of a three-legged stool that balances President Biden's rescue efforts and brings balance to the lives of millions of Americans, and it is one of my priorities. In the Eviction Lab's rankings of communities with the highest eviction rates, South Carolina is all too well represented in all three categories: large cities, mid-sized cities, and rural areas. This is a crisis that predates the pandemic. The House passed Build Back Better Act invests $151 billion in our nation's affordable housing infrastructure. This includes significant funding in key areas like rental assistance, public housing construction, and rehabilitation, the Housing Trust Fund, and much more. Build Back Better, as passed by the House, also includes enhancements to the low-income housing tax credit, which I have been working to strengthen ever since the 2017 Republican tax bill weakened it. In addition to ensuring that the tax code promotes affordable housing, we must also ensure that state and local governments do the same. That's why Senator Booker and I introduced the HOME Act, which will require recipients of federal funds to develop and implement strategies to increase the availability of affordable housing. The House passed Build Back Better Act includes $1.75 billion for this purpose. In addition to Build Back Better, I am working through the appropriations process to ensure that we provide additional funding for legal services to prevent evictions, to build on the $20 million that was provided in FY21. This funding is based on the Legal Assistance to Prevent Evictions Act, which I introduced with Congressman David Price. Another priority of mine is expanding the 2030 funding formula to ensure that funds reach persistent poverty communities. In fiscal year 2021 appropriations, we succeeded for the first time in enacting a provision that incorporates the 10-20-30 approach to a housing program. The omnibus appropriations bill included a $5 million competitive grant at HUD for competitive grants to nonprofit or private sector organizations to provide technical assistance to local governments or nonprofit organizations that serve areas of persistent poverty. My faith teaches that we will be judged by our deeds, not our words. I am proud of the substantive deeds President Biden and this Democratic Congress have accomplished for the American people. There is clear evidence that more needs to be done, but I have faith that this president and this Congress are not done yet. I encourage you to call on your senators to stand up and support making America's greatness accessible and affordable for all by passing the Build Back Better Act. We are working hard to help all of our fellow Americans through this difficult time. Thank you for working with us, and thank you for having me with you today.
Thank you so much, Congressman. We are so glad to have you in our corner pushing for housing resources. I want to first let you know that there's a lot of activity going on in the chat box. People are thanking you for your lifelong service in Congress and elsewhere, fighting for civil rights, fighting for housing justice. So we appreciate you joining us today. I did want to also thank you for pointing out some of the legislation that you've worked on recently to expand access to legal assistance and to help provide more funding to rural communities, especially persistent poverty counties. We'll provide some follow-up information to everybody on this call so they know more about your legislative achievements on that. But I want to thank you for raising those today. To go back to Build Back Better, many of our advocates are very focused and have been focused on pushing for Build Back Better, especially the historic investments in rental assistance, public housing, and the Housing Trust Fund. And we're wondering, what can advocates do right now to help work with you, to help with other congressional Democrats to get this bill across the finish line?
Well, thank you very much for the question. As I said, I think we need to really focus on the senators, get them to understand that Build Back Better has to be passed in order to bring balance to this recovery. We've had these kinds of issues before. We can go all the way back to the 30s when we had to come back from the Great Depression. All of us know that the country came back, but in coming back, we left pockets of poverty throughout the country that should not have been left. We built back from the Great Recession back in 2009. But everybody knows that a lot of communities got left out of that recession. What we need to do now that we've passed the Rescue Act to stabilize American families, we've now passed the infrastructure bill that will provide jobs and other much needed services to communities throughout the country. But for there to be balance in people's lives, people who want to go back to work need to be able to go back to work, knowing or feeling that their children will be safe to live at home. That's in Build Back Better. People need to get into housing. We've got over $150 billion for affordable housing. That's in Build Back Better. So the trust fund, most of the real issues surrounding housing, which will create not just safe, clean housing, but job opportunities for people. You can't build a house unless you are providing employment for carpenters, for bricklayers, for plumbers, for electricians, for landscapers. These are job creations that you aren't going to get otherwise. And so we've got to impress upon the senators that Build Back Better is not just a slogan. It will bring balance to people's lives. If we continue to move forward with only the Rescue Act and the infrastructure bill, I guarantee you that the recovery that will take place among many of us who are well equipped with educational achievements and being able to work from home, we will be fine. But what will happen to those people whose job creations are in the affordable housing community? Those are the kinds of jobs that you cannot do from home.
I love that sentiment, and especially you bringing focus to, who are the communities, who are the people who are consistently left behind in a recovery process. We know that the lowest income, the most marginalized households were facing a housing crisis before the pandemic. They've gone through incredible turmoil during the pandemic, and now we have to build back in a way that addresses their needs so that everyone has an opportunity to live in a thriving community in a safe, affordable home. So thank you for bringing that up. Just one more question for you, if you have time. Sure. I know that you are probably in the midst of important conversations right now over negotiations over the Build Back Better Act. Can you tell us what to expect about negotiations going forward, or where they are currently? What do we need to know in order for us to do our advocacy?
Well, when I find out, I'll be glad to tell you. As it stands now, 2 days ago, I thought I knew exactly where we are. On yesterday, I found out I may not be right about that. I'm working, having gotten into Washington earlier today, to try to find out exactly where we are. I do feel that Senator Joe Manchin has made some comments that I thought meant that we were on the way to reaching some kind of a compromise. I heard within the last 24 hours, those talks may have broken off and may not be going on. Now, I have not been able to confirm that, but that's what I heard in some reported media. But irrespective of all of that, I'm convinced that President Joe Biden knows that he is not going to be able to achieve the recovery that he wants to achieve unless we get Build Back Better done. So I know he's going to be in Georgia tomorrow talking voting. I'll be helping to reinforce that as well. But I do not think he has stepped away from Build Back Better yet. I know he wants to find some common ground because let's just face it, we gotta get people back to work, and especially female heads of households. They're not going back to work unless they feel their children can be saved, and they're not going back to work if they don't have sufficient child care opportunities for their children. And it's in Build Back Better that we've got the child tax credit, which expired December 31st, 2021. For that to continue, we got to pass Build Back Better. Now, I know that Joe Manchin has had some issues with whether or not we should just do it across the board or whether or not we'll take a look at trying to determine where we should target that. I don't have a problem with that. I don't think we ought to cut off discussions if we don't get everything that we want. So if he feels that we ought to do something about determining eligibility and making sure it gets to the most needy among us, then let's do that. But let's not throw out the baby with the bathwater.
Yes, well, we stand ready to work with you, to work with other members of Congress, to work with President Biden to get this bill across the finish line. I want to thank you so much for joining us today. We appreciate all of the work that you have done and continue to do to fight for housing justice. And we are ready to work with you. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much. And let me say once again that we're in a much, much better place today on housing evictions than we were prior to that hearing that your president contributed so much to. Almost immediately, we saw states that had been a bit, let's just say, recalcitrant in moving forward on that issue. Step up and start to do great work. My state's one of them. And so I want to thank you all once again for all you did and you continue to do on that issue. And if we continue to work together and stay vigilant, I think we get to a better place in the not too distant future.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us. And with that, I will turn it back to Paul.
Thank you.
What a great presentation from Congressman Clyburn. What an inspiring message to all of us to keep doing everything that we possibly can to push forward on Build Back Better, to get the key housing components passed in that. So please, please do everything you can on that, on the appropriations bill that will be coming up, and also on influencing your emergency rental assistance programs, as we talked about also today. I just don't want to remind everybody that Monday of next week is Martin Luther King holiday, and so we will not be holding the usual Monday HoUSed call. We will instead be doing it on Tuesday. So just mark your calendars at 2:30 Eastern time. On Tuesday, the 18th, is when we'll hold this call, which we normally hold on every Monday. So please be sure to look out for our email communications about that, and register for next Tuesday's call. Have a great week, everybody, and thank you for participating. Thank you also to all of our panelists who were phenomenal this week. Thank you so much for your presentations. Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.